Now on Radio 4, and a change to our schedule as part of our series of programmes to mark the passing of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, Martha Kearney presents a special edition of Archive on 4. In this programme, she explores the very particular contribution to our language that the Queen made across her long reign through her speeches and broadcasts. The Queen's English.
The death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II has been marked here in the heart of London at Buckingham Palace and throughout the world. Her voice, her words, her speeches helped to forge an identity unlike any other. In this special edition of Archive on 4, we'll analyse how those utterances, private and public, came to define the woman and the monarch. We'll hear from people who've studied her rhetoric and speaking style, as well as those who knew the Queen personally, like the first ever female Speaker of the House of Commons, Baroness Boothroyd, Betty Boothroyd.
I had a conversation with her on one occasion. It was about presidents visiting. She said, sometimes we may not approve of it, we don't want to do it. But she said, I say to my family and I say to myself, it is not what you want to do. You represent this country and therefore you must do it. It has to be done whether you like the individual or you don't like the individual. That doesn't enter into it at all. You are the representative of this country and it has to be done whether you like it or not.
That sense of duty observed by Betty Boothroyd informed everything the Queen did, what she said, and more pertinently, didn't say. Throughout the programme, we'll hear from experts like the distinguished political historian Peter Hennessy, a crossbench peer.
She did have a way with words and a feel for the context. Those Christmas broadcasts repay study, but also the things that really mattered to her, like her Christian faith, and that was very, very impressive. But the speech which for me probably stands out from all the rest was in that ghastly period when we slogged our way to Brexit. She made the best speech of Brexit in January 2019 to the Sandringham Women's Institute. That speech about the need to rediscover our traditions of civility and tolerance and to see the big picture was beautifully crafted, beautifully judged, and it was utterly, utterly her.
The Queen was, of course, the longest reigning British monarch in history, a still point in an era of huge change, both here and across her beloved Commonwealth, all reflected in the Queen's public words, as Prime Minister Tony Blair's former speechwriter Philip Collins observes.
If you go back through the history of the Queen's addresses, you can find a chronicle of the time. So you find references to, for example, the death of Nehru. You find the imprisonment of Nelson Mandela. The assassination of Martin Luther King is referenced. You find Britain's entry into the European Union, constant references to troubles in Northern Ireland, the Falklands. In 1991, in just about the only departure into something approaching a political opinion, she made a speech in defence of democracy at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So the whole of history of that period is gently chronicled in those speeches.
We begin, though, near the start of that journey, on a blustery, damp day in June 1953, where the cut-class vowels and dazzlingly precise diction of the BBC's commentary team were matched only by the glittering spectacle they were describing.
And now the coach moves. The coach is leaving the Queen's home on the greatest day of her life. There is no sun out here at the moment, but the sun is concentrated in the glorious gold of that lovely coach and in the Queen's smile, serenely happy, radiant, untroubled.
And there we had this beautiful Queen with her dashing young consort in the carriage going to Westminster Abbey. I watched it on one of those tiny postage stamp type television screens.
The coronation, from a 21st century perspective, appears steeped in centuries of tradition, but actually the Queen herself was a symbol of modernity. In 1953, the political historian Peter Hennessy was a young schoolboy.
And I was nurtured in that expectation that somehow that it was the juxtaposition of deep tradition in that service of coronation and modernity. Because I read the Eagle comic every week, and there was the cutout of the new Hawker Hunter fighter bomber, you see, and the new Gatwick Airport, which is going to solve London's air traffic problems forever. Another one I remember is Calder Hall, the first civil nuclear power station. And here we were, it's as if we'd cracked it, this ancient traditional country, right on the rim of modernity. There was optimism. And she was the dazzling epicentre.
The new Elizabethan age, full of expectations, full of uncertainties, was celebrated in music like Benjamin Britten's new opera, Gloriana, and on a more modest scale, Ronald Binge's Andante Cantabile was rebranded as Elizabethan Serenade and enjoyed on wirelesses throughout the country. Philip Collins, writer for the Times newspaper and former speechwriter for Tony Blair, grew up in a strongly royalist home.
I grew up in a deeply monarchical household, and I was named Philip after Prince Philip, and my sister is called Elizabeth. So we were absolutely attuned to listening to the Queen whenever she spoke, which she did but rarely. And her voice, if you hear the Queen's voice down the years, it changed quite a lot. So the Queen, early in her reign, was really very received pronunciation of a kind which barely exists anymore. And she became, over time, a little bit more upper middle class, in keeping with the very idea of monarchy which she presided over. So her language and her voice itself traces a progression of monarchy during the long period of Queen Elizabeth II's reign.
And it's that distinctive voice and the way it's evolved over a whole lifetime that we're exploring in this programme.
Thousands of you in this country have had to leave your homes and be separated from your fathers and mothers. My sister Margaret Rose and I feel so much for you, as we know from experience what it means to be away from those we love most of all. To you, living in new surroundings, we send a message of true sympathy. And at the same time, we would like to thank the kind people who have welcomed you to their homes in the country.
Princess Elizabeth, aged just 14, broadcasting on the BBC's Children's Hour programme in 1940 to comfort other children who were being evacuated from their city homes and parents to the safety of the countryside. Her own many hours of listening to radio news about the war can be detected in this professional broadcast, but an empathetic one too, in the way she delivers her message of comfort and understanding. The young princess already knew her audience. Bennett Brandreth QC is a barrister and writes on the techniques of rhetoric.
One of the things that struck me was how she was already so polished as a performer. I don't mean just clarity of diction, I don't mean just the pacing, but also her ability to lend emotional underpinning to what she was saying. It was astonishing at that age. The language she uses, she talks about her experience and the experience of others. She talks about sympathy. She talks about all of us children, making her at once part of the audience. There's a wonderful pathos in the way that she spoke.
Well, as I'm a cousin, obviously I met her as a child. We were sometimes invited, to have tea and to play in the gardens, which was great fun.
One of the late Queen's former ladies-in-waiting, Lady Pamela Hicks, who was also her cousin, in an archive recording from 2002.
She's very direct and very thorough. She's a no-nonsense person, no frills, and therefore is always interesting, really. Because you feel there's no shilly-shallying, there's no sort of surface nonsense.
As you could hear from that interview, Lady Hicks shares with the late Queen the clear diction and cut-glass accent of her class. Here's another member of that royal circle, Esme Lady Cromer, one of her ladies of the bedchamber, also recorded in 2002.
The Queen's a very shy person. I'm shy, so I think one shy person always knows another one. But I think one thing that I was amazed about was when I first started my duties was her wonderful smile. And I thought this was one of the most wonderful smiles I'd ever seen in my life.
And there was a sort of wide, generous smile when she was younger at all times. It was quite glorious, in fact, her smile. And of course, she refound that in older age, but it was very much part of that.
The Queen's famous smile also celebrated by Penny Dyer, one of the country's leading theatrical voice coaches. She's made a special study of the way the Queen spoke and was consultant to Helen Mirren when she took on the role of the Queen for the film of the same name.
So there was an openness and the eyes were wide and there was a lift in the cheeks and open nostrils. But the voice and the larynx was a great deal higher. And of course that was part and parcel of women of those days. You know, just physiologically, you were held in by your clothes and everything was pushed up, you know. You got away from what we would call the vulnerable areas, you know. And so the larynx actually sat in a higher position in the mouth. So she very much had that.
Leading voice coach Penny Dyer with her personal explanation for the particular vowel sounds and tight-lipped delivery of the royal household. With a more academic linguistic approach, Professor Jonathan Harrington of the University of Munich has spent many years making a syllable-by-syllable analysis of the Queen's many annual Christmas messages. By the beginning of the millennium, Harrington's research had discovered that the Queen's vowels were no longer as cut glass as they'd once been. It soon became headline news. The independent newspaper splashed with, "Cor blimey, even the Queen no longer speaks the Queen's English," while a leading article in The Guardian claimed, "All today's most popular figures, from Jonathan Ross to Jamie Oliver, speak Mockney. The Queen's simply trying to get in on the act. They're nothing if not adaptable, these royals. Ain't that the truth, you Madge?" So I wondered, what was the starting point from which Her Majesty had so markedly slipped?
In the 1950s, she spoke in a form of what was called URP. U can stand for upper crust RP, which was characteristic of the upper classes. RP, received pronunciation, is standard English where you can't really tell where the person is from. And there are still many elements of URP in her speech in the later broadcasts. In the 1950s, this was a very class-divided society. And then this all began to change in the 1960s, of course. And so associated with that then is blending of the sharply divided accents which are marked by class. And so the Queen will have come into contact, say, with more middle-class speakers than she would have done in the 1950s. There's a set of vowel changes which has occurred since the 1950s. But I mean, I would say things like, "That man is wearing a black hat," so it's ah, ah, ah. Now, in the 1950s, it was, "That man is wearing a black hat." And what we did was we had broadcasts of hers from the 1950s and broadcasts from BBC newsreaders, in fact, from the 1980s. And so we predicted then that the vowel space of the Queen from the 1980s should fall roughly between the positions from her 1950s broadcasts and the BBC newsreaders. And that's exactly what we found. So that this indicates then that the accent of the Queen shifted then in the direction of this more mainstream received pronunciation, which is exactly what you'd expect, of course. Your accent is shaped by your starting position and then the people that you come into contact with.
She's a marvellous mimic, so she can be devastatingly funny. And she has a very retentive memory. And of course, one enjoys it all enormously, and then you think, oh dear, I wonder what I sounded like. The Queen's enormous fun to be with. And fascinating also, because, when she's been doing a function or when she's met somebody and you happen to be with her, she, very often describes the event. And she is very observant. She doesn't miss a trick. I mean, you can never hide anything from the Queen.
Lady Pamela Hicks. The Queen was, however, extremely good at hiding herself from us. Or perhaps we should say it only giving us the minimum amount of personal information. And fundamentally, that was, of course, her role, not to grant interviews, as others in the royal family have done. She was always reserved, shy perhaps, as Lady Cromer said. But above all, as head of state, the Queen took her role and duties very seriously, and that meant representing the UK rather than herself. The first ever female Speaker of the House of Commons, serving from 1992 until the millennium, Betty Boothroyd, was at hand when the Queen delivered numerous speeches to Parliament. She's also a member of one of the country's most exclusive clubs, the Order of Merit. Only 24 men and women may be members of the Order at any one time. It's in the personal gift of the monarch. I caught up with Baroness Boothroyd at her office in the House of Lords. You talked about receiving the Order of Merit, which is a very rare honour in British public life. What was that like?
Well, I was very surprised. In fact, that morning I was putting lining paper into the drawers of my new flat because I'd moved out of being Speaker, and I had to give my hands a scrub and my nails a scrub, and off I went to the palace. It was as simple as that. So it was really rather thrilling, actually. I was very pleased about it. And it's just a lovely medal. It's very nice. I wear it occasionally. I'm delighted to have it. And the Queen used to give us lunches, all the OMs, because it's her order. And we had a photograph taken with her, which I'm very proud of, so that is, I have that hanging on my walls.
You've described yourself, and I think we've got a sense of it listening to you now, as a royalist. The Queen represented for many people the epitome of selfless public service.
I entirely agree with what you said. She had a real sense of duty. She worked herself daily, hard. I had a conversation with her on one occasion. It was about visiting presidents, I don't need to name them. She said, sometimes we may not approve of it, we don't want to do it. But she said, I say to my family and I say to myself, it is not what youth want to do. You represent this country and therefore you must do it.
As many have remarked, it was that sense of duty that defined the Queen's life, pretty much from childhood. She famously articulated it in one of her first and most significant public utterances as an adult.
Cape Town, April the 21st, 1947.
On this 21st of April, the people of the mother city of the Union of South Africa have been honoured and are happy to have with them Her Royal Highness Princess Elizabeth.
It was the occasion of her coming of age, her 21st birthday.
Everybody stood up and sang, "Happy birthday to you, happy birthday, dear princess, happy birthday to you."
There is a motto which has been borne by many of my ancestors, a noble motto, I serve. Those words were an inspiration to many bygone heirs to the throne when they made their knightly dedication as they came to manhood. I cannot do quite as they did, but through the inventions of science, I can do what was not possible for any of them. I can make my solemn act of dedication with the whole empire listening. I should like to make that dedication now. It is very simple. I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong.
It's very touching now and rather bittersweet, I think, to listen to that broadcast that the Queen made in South Africa on her 21st birthday in April 1947, when she said, "I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong." You couldn't say that today.
Professor David Cannadine of Princeton University specialises in, amongst many areas, the history of the British Empire.
And that's partly because the empire doesn't exist anymore, and perhaps it's partly because that concept of service that the Queen certainly embodied throughout her life is very much associated with her wartime generation. Part of the purpose of that South African trip was for the Princess Elizabeth, as she then was, to decide whether she was or wasn't going to marry Prince Philip. It was only the second of the settler dominions, as they were then called, that a British monarch as reigning monarch had ever visited, Canada being the first in 1939. And I think it's difficult for us now to grasp, when everywhere is only a few hours away by plane, how amazing those early royal tours were.
David Cannadine. It was indeed a very different world, technologically, socially, and of course, linguistically. Dr. Sam Helmuth is a linguist at the University of York who specialises in the study of intonation and the way in which people use their voices to express themselves.
I went back to that very famous part in her 21st birthday speech, "My whole life, whether it be short or long, will be devoted to your service." That was such a profound thing for such a young person to say. But what's interesting is that even with sort of structured variation within the pacing, the actual rhythm, the speech rate is remarkably consistent. And that's one of the things I noticed comparing speeches over a long period of time. So starting, at her 21st birthday and up to 70 years later, actually when you measure the speech rate, it hasn't changed over that very long period, which is remarkable. A hallmark of her style was quite a slow pace with longer pauses than we would use in spontaneous speech probably. But it's not unusual, it's not weirdly slow, and there's this alternation between the sequences of short and long phrases to break up the rhythm. And it stops the speech from sounding as if it's being read. And we should remember that in the early years, all the broadcasts would have been live. So once she'd found a pace and a rhythm that worked, she stuck to it.
But I shall not have the strength to carry out this resolution alone, unless you join in it with me, as I now invite you to do. I know that your support will be unfailingly given. God help me to make good my vow, and God bless all of you who are willing to share in it.
The Queen had beautiful diction in all of the recordings. When I'm looking at them fine-grainedly, they're very easy it's beautiful data to work with. All of the consonants, for example, all the final T's and K's are really beautifully produced. Interestingly, I also did a small comparison of the Queen's intonation patterns with those of her father, George VI, who famously struggled initially with public speaking and who we know from the King's Speech deliberately developed a specific speaking style as a strategy to overcoming his stutter, which he did successfully. And the Queen's style had some echoes of that deliberate style of delivery, but the pacing and the rhythm are quicker and the phrases are longer and the pauses are shorter. But the thing they shared is this very clear sense of this being prepared speech. And I think we see that and we hear that in the diction, because the King's diction was very, very clear as well. So again, to me, that brings me back to this sense of care being taken.
She found a style very early on and she stuck with it. That in itself gave us a sense of continuity.
Rhetorician and barrister Bennett Brandreth QC.
That the world was fundamentally unchanged in a way that was very reassuring, that made it almost seem like however else the world changes, still there is the Queen, still she is speaking to us as she spoke to us when she was 14, and still she is, as she said so early on, holding to her values. And that's something that I don't think we'll ever get back in that same sense, because now whatever happens, whatever the new monarch is like, whatever their new speaking style is like, inevitably we will have heard them from the very outset, seen them from the very outset. But it was also what was rather wonderful about the Queen never changing. She was the rock that one could always return to when the turbulent waters swirled around us.
When she died, I thought to myself, and she was laid to rest in St George's Chapel, Windsor, this really is the end of the post-war era, because her glorious reign, and it has been glorious, was coterminous with it. She was the monarch of the post-war settlement. And indeed, as she used to say, she said it the year of the anniversary of the D-Day landings when President Trump came, that my generation was the wartime generation. And her genius, and I think that genuinely is a word one can use, was to adapt to that without making any tremendous dashes towards fad or fashion. It was beautifully judged, and she did it perfectly. She was, and she will always remain, certainly for me, the gold standard monarch.
Historian Peter Hennessy.
And there they are, waving and cheering to the crowd. Now the bride herself is waving and cheering. This is the picture of the day that we shall all remember.
1947 saw the young princess married to Philip Mountbatten, now created Duke of Edinburgh. The young couple embarked on tours of the Commonwealth with new and much bigger audiences for her speeches.
Canada, October 9th, 1951. In the east, with morning, comes a feeling of waiting, a feeling felt westward, until it seems the forests are listening for a message. The plains, the mountains, the cities, the towns, the farms, listen and wait.
And the princess and her husband found themselves fated as never before.
Men, women, or children, there is no one quite untouched by the sense of expectancy that has come with the morning.
Now in the Colosseum, the waiting is over, and 18,000 Canadian children meet a real live princess, their princess.
Tonight, my husband and I start upon our long journey, which will lead us twice across the breadth of this continent. I need not tell you, I am sure, with what feelings of hope and expectation we look forward to it. Tomorrow night from Ottawa, I shall be able to speak to you again. Tonight, I only wish to tell you all how happy I am to be amongst you. Je vois dans l'accueil que j'ai reçu du Québec aujourd'hui, Monsieur le Premier ministre, l'assurance de vos vœux pour un heureux voyage, et je vous en sais gré.
The detail of her accent change. There's that lovely speech where she speaks in French. She has quite a nice French accent, though she has quite English intonation patterns in her French.
Phonetician Dr. Sam Helmuth.
The kind of changes that Jonathan Harrington and co found, which are these changes in the Queen's vowel quality, so subtle changes in her accent, I think people will not have noticed those, because those changes in vowels are the kinds of changes that are quite subtle that we tend not to notice. I think you notice them when you go back and listen to an old broadcast, and it's jarring that the Queen had such a, what we might call, cut glass accent. The fact that the Queen's English changed over time is normal and natural. So it shows that although she had this very consistent delivery, she did change with the times.
This is London. It is with the greatest sorrow that we make the following announcement. It was announced from Sandringham at 10:45 today, February the 6th, 1952, that the King, who retired to rest last night in his usual health, passed peacefully away in his sleep earlier this morning.
The death of Princess Elizabeth's father, King George VI, was sudden and unexpected. She was plunged into the public eye, but while Prince Philip was prepared to be interviewed by television and radio, the Queen was steadfast. Her opinions were locked away from public scrutiny. Times newspaper writer and speechwriter to Prime Minister Tony Blair, Philip Collins.
The Queen really invented a new kind of monarchy, and that was at least as much derived from what she didn't say as what she did. If you think of the incredibly tumultuous political events that have taken place since 1952 until the present day, and on how many of them do we have any indication of the Queen's thoughts? Virtually nothing. That was not the case prior to Queen Elizabeth II, where the monarchy had a much closer connection with politics. And it may not be the case with her son and successor. We shall see. But we have a model of modern monarchy which is essentially based on silence, which will be very fascinating to see with the new king, who may not have the forbearance to be as silent on public matters as his mother has been.
While over the years we became more than familiar with the Queen's public persona, in 2006, Helen Mirren was the latest in a long line of actors who've had to try to capture the essence of the Queen's personal speaking voice in her private, her conversational style.
You are my 10th Prime Minister, Mr. Blair. My first, of course, was Winston Churchill. He sat in your chair in frock coat and top hat. He was kind enough to give a shy young girl like me quite an education.
I can imagine.
With time, one has hopefully added experience to that education and a little wisdom, better enabling us to execute our constitutional responsibility. To advise, guide, and warn the government of the day.
Advice which I look forward to receiving.
Helen Mirren as the Queen, and Michael Sheen doing a pretty good impression of a newly elected Tony Blair. That careful and constant discretion that Her Majesty maintained for almost the whole of her life made the job of Helen Mirren's distinguished voice coach Penny Dyer doubly hard. How did you go about researching that private voice? Because we don't really hear it, do we?
No, we don't. So what we did was we observed. I mean, she was a very disciplined young lady, apparently loved doing jigsaws, crosswords, and so things that are formulaic. And what we discovered, and it was Helen actually who pointed it out, was that she used to keep all her shoes in boxes. And we went, yes, that's it. There's something about the voice that is kept in a box. And we had to say, OK, so we need to throw those shoes around a bit. We need to mess it all up a little bit. So we had that. We found the vocal hold. We found the delay between the short phrasing, that she would have, which would allow her time to think what she was saying rather than being spontaneous.
Hello, Helen. I'm just going to talk to you for a while, as the Queen, a little bit about what we were discussing the other day in your beautiful garden, about this hold on the voice. The Queen holds her breath before she speaks. So there is actually what you would call a vocal hold. It's the sort of thing that...
And you talk about this concept, vocal hold, which shows an emotional truth as well.
Exactly. I mean, for me, the Queen had a very true voice, an archaic accent, but she had a very true voice. Margaret Thatcher quoted her as having a formal informality, which I thought was pretty accurate, actually.
And then there's the stiff upper lip.
That's an actual stiff upper lip, which of course is part and parcel of the vocal hold, only it's a speech hold, so to speak. So I said to Helen, why don't we get you to try putting a face mask on your face and realise that part of that stiff upper lip, which is all about not showing the emotion, not being allowed to show the emotion, putting the duty before emotion, which of course is absolutely what you have to do when you grow up in the royal family, and then of course suddenly you become a queen, you are literally frozen so that the vowel shapes that are normally rounded, like O and ow and o and or, you lose the lip rounding. The actual stiff upper lip gives you what's called a lateral fix. Now, there were many people in the old days, and the lateral fix was absolutely like a sort of an inane grin. We're all having a marvellous time. Here we are, between two world wars, but we're not going to talk about it. But the Queen didn't do that, thank goodness. The mouth was relatively relaxed so that those vowel sounds that we just spoke about, instead of O, you would hear O, and instead of ow, you would hear ow, and instead of o and or, as in taking the dog for a walk, you would hear taking the dog for a walk, taking the dog for a walk, even taking the dog for a walk.
In fact, we did get one or two very brief glimpses of the Queen's more relaxed conversational voice in the 1969 film Royal Family, with its behind-the-scenes footage only shown once on our screens. And more recently in the ITV programme The Queen's Green Planet, when she walked around Buckingham Palace Gardens with Sir David Attenborough, examining its many trees, her dry sense of humour mocking the placing of garden ornaments.
Well, I suppose actually the trees with which you will be presented are going to change as our climate changes, and that there will be all kinds of different trees growing here in another 50 years maybe.
Might easily be, yes. I won't be here though.
I was going to say, a sundial neatly planted in the shade.
Isn't it good, yes. Had we thought of that it was planted in the shade? It wasn't in the shade originally, I'm sure. But maybe we could move it.
Depends whether you want to know the time or not.
Two 93-year-olds wandering through the trees. It was as if the cameras weren't there at all. Very different from when the Queen delivered her first televised Christmas broadcast in 1957, when the 31-year-old spoke directly into the camera.
Happy Christmas. 25 years ago, my grandfather broadcast the first of these Christmas messages. Today is another landmark, because television has made it possible for many of you to see me in your homes on Christmas Day. My own family often gather round to watch television, as they are at this moment, and that is how I imagine you now. I very much hope that this new medium will make my Christmas message more personal and direct.
You're or were a professional speechwriter yourself, notably writing for Tony Blair when he was Prime Minister. What do you detect about the kind of phrases that were used in her speeches?
Bear in mind that the modern monarchy was essentially predicated on silence. So the primary rhetorical virtue of the Queen was simply to be. It wasn't to say. And for the most part, she managed to project a sense of wisdom through not really saying very much.
Philip Collins.
So for someone who's been a presence in our lives for such a long time, we have very little to go on, very little to analyse. But the themes which are there from the beginning are, firstly, family. The idea of family recurs over and over, and it's a very important thing. It's not just a platitude. It's not just a way of binding a nation. It's also a way of describing modern monarchy, because the idea of the royal family becomes the most critical component of what the monarchy is under Queen Elizabeth II. And so she routinely returns to this idea. Christmas is a time for family, and family is what we are.
Here at home, my own family is a little larger this Christmas. As so many of you will know, the arrival of a baby gives everyone the chance to contemplate the future with renewed happiness and hope.
That is then often coupled, sometimes not very cleverly, with the idea of the Commonwealth. And the Commonwealth is usually written up as a family of nations. And sometimes, like in 1956, a good example, you get the combination of those two elements, where the family becomes a metaphor for the family of nations. Then the third thing, which is probably more notable by its absence, given the extraordinary fact of having had a woman on the throne for so long, is it's a rare event when the Queen refers explicitly to her status as a woman, as a queen. Now, the great monarchical speech in British history is Elizabeth I. You know, I may have the weak and feeble body of a woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England too. And the very idea we have of the indomitable Elizabeth I derives from that speech. And it's a remarkable piece of rhetoric. You don't have anything comparable in the canon of Elizabeth II, where she very rarely names the fact that she's a woman or reflects on that. 1966, there's a brief reference to the wave of feminism which is happening, but for such an extraordinary social movement, and to have somebody so famous and so prominent as a woman in that role throughout, I think it's quite notable how little she says on that topic.
The consistent and carefully maintained silence on all but the most anodyne issues made the Queen's public utterances a subject for constant press scrutiny, journalists quarrying the slightest change of emphasis for evidence of what the Queen actually thought. Historian Peter Hennessy singles out two moments in the relatively recent past when the Queen did let her feelings show, and quite intentionally. At the time of the Scottish independence referendum in 2014, and when the country found itself increasingly divided during the wrangles over leaving the EU.
The scarcity, the rarity of her interventions in big matters, big questions facing her state, meant that when she did speak, everybody listened, and she did it beautifully. It was always very careful, and of course there are those who could argue, who might argue, that she got away with it because of the huge credit in her bank, in the Bank of the British Monarchy, because it was how she conducted herself. But the speech which for me probably stands out from all the rest was in that ghastly period when we slogged our way to Brexit. She made the best speech of Brexit in January 2019 to the Sandringham Women's Institute. That speech about the need to rediscover our traditions of civility and tolerance and to see the big picture. It was only 3 paragraphs, if I remember, but everybody got the thrust and the import of it. And just for a while, we behaved a little bit better in that ghastly Brexit debate. It ranks with her remarks in the Crathy churchyard on the Sunday before the Scottish independence referendum of 2014, when she asked the people of Scotland, every patch of Scotland she cherished, to think very carefully about it. And that mattered. So she was a gold standard monarch. She never put a foot wrong, but she had really big gold reserves to draw on.
3 cheers for Her Majesty the Queen. Hip hip! Hip hip!
In 1977, 25 years after her reigny coronation, the Queen was out on another damp June day to celebrate her Silver Jubilee with a series of beacon fires lit across the nation.
And there's the first shoot of flame and the smoke. It's got very wet this afternoon.
Next point. Second serve. Stovey serves. It's right. A forehand return by way down the line. Stovey can't get it. Virginia has won.
Virginia Wade has won the centenary title with the Queen watching her. Virginia will take tea with the Queen.
When I was 21, I pledged my life to the service of our people, and I asked for God's help to make good that vow. Although that vow was made in my salad days when I was green in judgment, I do not regret nor retract one word of it.
Few who were around in 1977 will forget the beacons, the parades, the walkabouts and commemorative spoons and mugs, not to mention a Royal Wimbledon, that marked Silver Jubilee year. I myself bought a fine pair of glittery Union Jack socks. Royal events have been the backdrop to our own lives, punctuated by royal jubilees and the ritual of Christmas Day messages. Bennett Brandreth, but first, phonetician Dr. Sam Helmuth.
I think above all it's familiar, isn't it? We've heard it, certainly for me, my family, we didn't always sit down and listen to the Queen live, but we usually recorded her and watched her when we'd finished our dinner. And so it's part of the soundtrack of our lives, and it's always there at points of serious reflection.
That ritual of the family all gathering on Christmas Day, making sure they'd finish their lunch in time to be able to sit down and hear the Queen speak, is something so central to so many people and yet so difficult to convey. I know it particularly because I have an American wife, and she doesn't have that background, that upbringing, so much so that I hadn't even really noticed that there was that sort of sense of place and time, and another year has passed. For her, it was an archaic thing. My wife found it harder to get over what might be described as quite 1940s vowel sounds. For us, it wasn't something that reached out to the past. It was the same thing happening again and again and again. There was that sense of continuity.
For the former Speaker of the House of Commons, Betty Boothroyd, the royal voice marked out a different set of ritual public occasions, like the formal opening of Parliament and the announcement of the government's business for the forthcoming session, the Queen's speech.
They were all written for her, though, don't forget. It wasn't her own work. I think as the years went by, her speech has got rather more interesting, if I may say so. And a deeper voice, the vocabulary she used. I believe that at the state opening, there is a tradition where there is only so many words in the Queen's speech. Otherwise, of course, it could go on forever. This is why at the end of the Queen's speech he said, other legislation will follow, because it can't go on forever.
And I suppose she had to do what's often exactly the opposite for politicians. She had to take any personality, any of her views out of what she was saying, particularly at the time of the state opening of Parliament when she delivered the Queen's speech, which is, of course, really the government's programme for the following year.
It was always amusing to hear the Queen's speech because if you look back at them over time, the Queen is speaking in the language of the era, and she's always reading out the language of that particular political configuration. So from 1997 onwards, the Queen sounds absolutely perfectly New Labour, as if she's been scripted by Peter Mandelson, which indeed she probably was. Prior to that, she sounded impeccably Thatcherite, and that's an important index of the role that the monarchy is meant to play within the liberal democracy, which is to be a neutral constitutional joint. But it's fascinating to hear that language, which very clearly not her own nor that of her team.
Speechwriter Philip Collins. Very much her own was the speech she delivered in November 1992, the year of the disastrous Windsor Castle fire and the separation of Prince Charles from Diana, Princess of Wales, not to mention Prince Andrew and Princess Anne's marital splits and some intrusively intimate revelations in books and magazines. The Queen was guest of honour at a lunch to mark 40 years on the throne at the Guildhall in the City of London. Her voice was thick with what appeared to be a heavy cold, which emphasised her natural gravitas and the sombre nature of her words.
1992 is not a year on which I shall look back with undiluted pleasure. In the words of one of my more sympathetic correspondents, it has turned out to be an annus horribilis. There can be no doubt, of course, But criticism is good for people and institutions that are part of public life. No institution, city, monarchy, whatever, should expect to be free from the scrutiny of those who give it their loyalty and support, not to mention those who don't.
There's a great deal of subtlety in the way that she spoke. That Annus Horribilis speech is a masterpiece of rhetorical subtlety.
Bennett Brandreth.
Even the rhetorical techniques that the Queen is using are ones that allow her to say a great deal without ever really having to state the obvious. She begins with a rhetorical technique called litotes. It's when you're trying to assert something by denying its opposite. And the Queen starts her speech with an example of litotes. She says it's not a year on which she'll look back with pleasure. And, of course, we understand that that is the most masterful piece of understatement. It's been the worst year of her reign. It's been the worst year of her life.
And, as you could hear from the reaction amongst the guests at the Guildhall, that dry, understated sense of humour was a note that went down well. For Baroness Boothroyd, it was the warmth and charm of the less public monarch that she remembers with affection.
I once went to lunch there and I was hopping about in a terribly old shoes and all broken, but I had a bad foot, the only thing I could wear, and I almost apologised to her, and she said, "Oh, I'm sorry, you've got a broken toe." I said, "I don't know, ma'am, because I haven't had anybody look at it yet." "Oh," she said, you can't walk around like that, if it's painful." So she had a great sort of familiarity and friendliness with people. She was very concerned about them, yeah.
And do you exchange a few words with her at a reception for the President of China?
She looked marvellous, of course, in all her diamonds. And I had been cautioned that the President of China liked music and he would break into song at the most formal occasions. So after about 4 courses, he broke into song and he said, "I'm going to sing you a little song from Peking Opera." Well, I was sitting near the top table close to the Thatchers and I said, "This is going to be like Screaming Cats." Anyway, it wasn't really. It was a nice little ditty and it didn't go on too long. So another few more chopsticks going, a few more courses we had. And he started again in English and he said, "I'm going to now to sing you a song from a musical, New York musical." So he started to sing this song. And I knew it so well, I still know it this day.
What was the song?
"Sweet songs of spring were sung, remember that morning in May, remember you loved me when we were young one day." And
so of course, your showbiz experience earlier in your
life. No,
life.
it was my mother. I learned that at my mother's knee. And I couldn't help but sort of mouth it and sing it a little bit, and he saw me. So he said to the ambassador, "Ambassador, give Madam Speaker a microphone, have her come here and sing this with me." And I just thought, I have to do this for Queen and country. Anyway, I got through it all very well. So on the way out, of course, we were all standing and the royals came out and the Queen came by and she said, "That was very nice, but I don't know how you remember all the words." I thought she was going to say, "We are not amused," but she didn't. She was very nice. She said, we enjoyed it all, but I don't know how you remember all the words. Now, since then, when I've met the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh, he particularly, but she also, just teases me about that occasion and tells everybody around, "This is the lady who sang with the Chinese president at our dinner party one night." And she remembers this, and it's rather a tease, and we all have a laugh about it.
This is BBC Television from London. A short while ago, Buckingham Palace confirmed the death of Diana, Princess of Wales.
It was the 31st of August 1997 when the Queen and the whole royal family were plunged into a tragedy without parallel in her long reign. If the Annus Horribilis of 1992 was the lowest point thus far for the family, the death of Diana, Princess of Wales, 5 years later, was a disaster that engulfed not only them, but the whole country in an outpouring of grief unparalleled in modern times. Prime Minister Tony Blair had been in office for only a few months, but his words captured the nation's shocked reaction.
She was the people's princess, and that's how she will stay, how she will remain in our hearts and in our memories forever.
The public grief was overwhelming. I remember so well interviewing people, queuing to sign the Book of Condolence at St James's Palace. But there was anger too, dangerously close to the Queen. She found herself not just in the middle of a family tragedy, but faced with a very difficult personal crisis.
The Queen is to broadcast to the nation on the eve of the funeral of Diana, Princess of Wales. Her press secretary spoke this morning.
The Queen has asked me to say that the royal family have been hurt by suggestions that they are indifferent to the country's sorrow at the tragic death of the Princess of Wales.
And she was away, she was up in Balmoral, and then finally came to speak to the country. What did you think about that?
I have to say, I thought that a mistake had been made by the Queen remaining out of London for such a long time.
Betty Boothroyd was Commons Speaker at the time.
Some people came to talk to me about what might be done. And I said the first thing you would do is to fly the flag outside Buckingham Palace at half-mast.
Because that was a great controversy, wasn't it, with the crowds outside?
That's right, the crowds outside wanted to see that. And then eventually, I think it was realised that because of the crowds, which she must have seen on television, she couldn't stay away. And I thought it was wonderful of her, very brave to sort of come and walk around in that crowd. She was there, on her 2 feet, meeting some of the people, as many as she could, outside those gates. And I thought that was... I could almost weep when I think about it. To come and to face up to it showed great courage. Well done, the Queen, I thought.
I can tell that must have been moving for you. The tears have come to your eyes recalling that, haven't they? Yes. And bravery too in making a public broadcast?
Yes. She's a lady that faced up to things. When she faced up to it, she had the courage and she did it all, and she did it well.
We have all been trying in our different ways to cope. It is not easy to express a sense of loss, since the initial shock is often succeeded by a mixture of other feelings: disbelief, incomprehension, anger, and concern for those who remain. We have all felt those emotions in these last few days. So what I say to you now, as your Queen and as a grandmother, I say from my heart. First, I want to pay tribute to Diana myself. She was an exceptional and gifted human being. In good times and bad, she never lost her capacity to smile and laugh, nor to inspire others with her warmth and kindness. I admired and respected her for her energy and commitment to others, and especially for her devotion to her 2 boys.
It was a moment of deep solemnity, and the Queen's words were carefully chosen. But in that highly charged atmosphere of heightened emotion, hundreds of thousands of flowers scenting the air at Kensington Palace, some felt that the royal expression of grief didn't reflect the public mood. Bennett Brandreth.
The nation needed somebody to speak from their heart, or at least to appear to do so at that point in time. But the Queen, by that point, so steeped, I think, in diplomacy and in the need to be very gentle in the way that she expressed herself, reached out and found that she didn't have the language she needed at that particular moment in time. It's not that she didn't feel it, it's not that she didn't want to reach out to the people. It's just that she had built for herself this wonderful wall of language that works so effectively in diplomatic circumstances, and suddenly we were in a moment where what we really wanted was a little ash in the hair and a little rending of the garments, and that wasn't the Queen's style. And in a way, in retrospect, we would have been very upset if that had been what had happened, because suddenly the Queen wouldn't have been the Queen anymore.
But in the wake of that crisis, the monarchy found a new resilience, and the Queen did move with the times, revealing a sense of humour that was mainly on show behind closed doors.
Good evening, Mr. Bond.
Good evening, Your Majesty.
The millions watching the 2012 Olympics could scarcely believe their eyes when the Queen appeared with Daniel Craig as James Bond, and then apparently parachuted into the stadium. The monarchy was indeed slowly modernising. It even acquired its own website and social media accounts. And the new approach was very much in evidence in 2011 with a state visit to the Republic of Ireland. Wearing a bright green outfit, the Queen stunned the crowds by opening with some words in the Irish language. Listen out for the gasps of appreciation.
Uachtaráin agus a Coisa. Prince Philip and I are delighted to be here and to experience at first hand Ireland's world-famous hospitality.
Together, we have much to celebrate: the ties between our people, the shared values, and the economic, business and cultural links that make us so much more than just neighbours, that make us firm friends and equal partners. Madam President, speaking here in Dublin Castle, it is impossible to ignore the weight of history, as it was yesterday when you and I laid wreaths at the Garden of Remembrance.
Those wreaths and the words in Irish were a much appreciated gesture of reconciliation, one of inclusion and peace that would eventually lead to her handshake in 2017 with the former IRA man, Martin McGuinness. That speech in Dublin, like so many over the years, showed the Queen's ability, through often understated and simple prose, to cut through fraught politics and history, to find a way of uniting divided people. To end, here are Betty Boothroyd and first the historian Peter Hennessy.
Her life is coterminous with so many of us, the post-war generation. She, apart from our own immediate families, is the one fixed point. And I remember thinking, at the height of the Brexit scratchiness that we were all living through, that the only bit of the Constitution that's working according to spec is the constitutional monarchy, because it's her. She was the one who was playing her part to perfection, and she never lowered herself, ever, below the level of events. And however long the British monarchy survives, which I think will be for a very long time, she will be the exemplar.
But if I may say so, I shall never forget the celebrations commemorating D-Day in the 75th anniversary, where the speech she made there, I thought that was one of the best. I remember it today. She was talking about that period of the D-Day landing. She said it was a resilient generation. And she was right. It was a wonderful choice of words. It was a resilient generation, more than we are today, if I may say so. But it was a resilient generation because we had a resilient leadership at that time.
And a generation, of course, which she was part of.
Absolutely. And she, I believe, in that speech, recognised all of that with those few words. It was a resilient generation.
Baroness Boothroyd ending that special tribute to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. The presenter was Martha Carney and the producer was Simon Elms. That was a change to the published Radio 4 schedule. If you tuned in to hear Bhopal, the story of the man who foretold the world's worst industrial disaster, you'll be able to find it and hear it on BBC Sounds.